Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here tonight. My name is Jenny Parker, and I'm the Vice President of Communications for the National Constitution Center. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's program in partnership with Temple University School of Media and Communications. We look forward to partnering with Temple University in the future for programs like this, and I would like to personally thank Dean David Boardman, Patrick Murphy, and Todd Brewster for their collaboration for tonight's program. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. Tonight's program is just one of the many thoughtful and timely constitutional conversations that we host at the National Constitution Center. For a schedule of upcoming programs, please visit constitutioncenter.org/debate or pick up a flyer on your way out. We will be taking audience questions tonight. Just jot your question down on the note card that's been handed out to you, and a staff member will collect them. Lastly, if you could take a few moments to silence your cell phones. And now I'm going to turn the program over to Dean David Boardman. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good evening and welcome. We're pleased to partner with the National Constitution Center on this event. It's the first of what we hope will be many collaborations, and I want to personally thank Jeffrey Rosen and the center staff for their support. I also want to thank our crew from Temple University Television, which is taping this for broadcast. It's also being streamed on the Constitution Center's website. When we conceived this conversation several months back, we thought there might be some interest in bringing together experts to discuss the role of the press in the presidential election that would have just concluded. Of course, we had no idea how essential this conversation would be on this, the day after. Starting at about 9 o'clock last night, and I'm sure many of you witnessed this, and extending throughout today, journalists have been engaged in a forlorn choreography, one in which they're simultaneously blaming and defending themselves and each other. They're stunned by their failure to predict the victory of Donald Trump, and many reporters openly are portraying the outcome, which of course is cheered by about half the electorate, as the press's failure, a judgment that in and of itself suggests something quite notable about the gulf between journalists and voters. We're joined tonight by 5 people who are paid to think, write, and teach about such matters. Before we bring our distinguished panel to the stage, I wanted to share 2 pieces of communication that I had this morning from young women in their 20s. One's a consumer of journalism, the other is a producer of journalism. The first was a text from my daughter, who grew up around newspapers when I was the editor of the Seattle Times. In it, she said, quote, "I feel scared by how wrong the media was about this. I had an inherent trust that the mainstream media was able to reflect reality, and this disrupts that." The second was an email from a former student I mentored in my first year at Temple 3 years ago. She now works for a major national digital publication. She writes, "I'm waking up today feeling both like this job is more important than ever and, in weird ways, has become less and less relevant to the public it serves. What are your thoughts? How to stay grounded? What do we need to do?" I'm hoping that our panel tonight will help me give these 2 young women useful responses. Here to lead our conversation is Todd Brewster. He's a distinguished member of our Temple faculty. He's a former senior editorial producer for ABC News, a best-selling author, and the former director of the National Constitution Center's Peter Jennings Project for Journalists and the Constitution. Please join me in welcoming Todd and our panelists, whom he will introduce.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you all for being here. Let me introduce who we have on our panel. Starting on my far left is Bryan Monroe. He's the Verizon Chair of Communications at Temple, former editor of CNN Politics. Next to Bryan, we have Kathleen Hall Jamieson, who is the director of the Annenberg Public Policy Center at the University of Pennsylvania. We have David Folkenflik, who is an NPR media correspondent. And we have Dylan I'm sorry, I'm blanking on your last name.
Byers.
Thank you. Dylan Byers, as a CNN reporter with us as well, who covers a lot of media. So I want everybody to begin by just taking a deep breath, okay? Inhale, exhale. Remember going through this with the Lamaze classes when my wife was pregnant, you know, maybe we can do that and get all that good vibe back into our lungs. We've had a terrifically stressful year of politicking, no matter which side you may be on this story. It's been an ordeal, I think, for the country, and it's been an ordeal for journalists in particular. I think we're here tonight to try to figure out in the first blush of this post-campaign atmosphere just exactly what journalists did right and what they did wrong in the course of this election season. So I want to tell you a little story that happened to me this morning. I was at Temple, and I happen to live in Connecticut, so I come down and teach 3 days a week, and I'm staying at the hotel there, and I'm on my way out to the gym, and I see two men gesticulating to each other very wildly. And I figured they must be talking about the election, right? So I go by and I hear one of them say to the other one, the media is the media is the one who did it. They elected Donald Trump. The other one said, yeah, and then Trump took care of them. So here we have this story that is kind of pervasive throughout the country, I think, that the media played a role in this election. What exactly that role is, I don't know. But I'll start by asking the question for my panel. Did the media elect Donald Trump? And we'll go first to Kathleen Hall Jamieson here.
No, but the media provided a venue with virtually open access throughout the primaries that increased the likelihood that with spending virtually no money on advertising, he would have the national access that made it possible for him to marginalize his opponents, dominate the electoral environment in ways that were unprecedented, and with an all but open mic into any call-in show he wanted to call into at any time of the day or night, transform what should have been news space into advertising at no cost.
But so in a sense, then, the media did play, by the way, the decisions of the programmers, the producers, or whether it was the technology itself, being able to tweet, be able to call in, the kind of 24-hour news environment did contribute to the building of Trump's fame during this time, right? What do you think, Bryan?
You know, I had a conversation with a major head of a network a few months ago about that very topic. Why were the networks, particularly the cable networks, allowing Trump to be on TV so much? And he was very clear. He said, look, their job as a journalism organization is to cover the most important race in the world, which is the race for president. And if any of the candidates want to talk about that, they will put them on the air at any time, for any reason, at any length. And in fact, during the primaries and even during the general, it was actually Hillary Clinton who was reluctant to be on TV, reluctant to hold press conference, reluctant to do a lot of media availabilities. Trump would do it at the drop of a dime. And so they saw it as their responsibility to take him up on it whenever they could. Now, that backfired, but at the time, it seemed like a good idea.
Well, David, what do you think? I mean, if Trump wants to come on television, wants to come on radio, wants to tweet, is it a requirement of the news media to cover that?
I think we're blurring a couple things here that played into this. I think Trump is not a creation of the news media. He's a self-created figure, right? But he was very much propelled to where he was to basically 100% name recognition by virtue of being a reality show star and then being taken seriously as a figure, I think, in politics, and in large measure because of statements he made as an entertainment star in places like the Today Show and others, and particularly because he was kind of the leading figure for the birther movement. And that gave him a certain platform and stature, even though it was founded on a lie, or at least on no factual foundation. He was given, exactly as Kathleen said, untrammeled, unedited, unexpurgated time, just vast swaths of real estate on cable channels during the primary season, which is different than also being given an extraordinary amount of time in the interview process. Now remember, there were 17 candidates in the Republican primary. From the moment he stepped on stage on the Fox debate, he made it about him and the moderators of the Fox News thing. So he iced out the other 9 people on stage for that grown-up debate. And he really made it about himself the entire time, dominating the airwaves. Why did that happen? It happened because we as viewers responded. And I don't think it was by accident that I was able to report a week or two ago that every network budgets in election cycle, they're going to make extra money a lot of extra money during the election cycle. CNN made an additional $100 million over that for its television stations and to some extent digitally as a result purely of the obsession and fascination with Donald Trump. That is a strong motivation to cover him in full. Things changed over the general election cycle, but I think that the press took him as an entertainment figure who happened to be playing out in a serious place rather than a serious figure who happened to be adopting sort of astonishingly non-conventional positions and statements. And I think that propelled him in a large way.
Can I
Sure.
piggyback off a couple things here? One, and I'm not defending the media, trust me, I have plenty of criticisms, but the question is always posed as, did the media elect Donald Trump? Is the media to blame for Donald Trump's rise? Someone on my network, CNN, said this in a much more succinct way than I will, but last night, but FDR used radio, JFK used television, President Obama used the internet, and Donald Trump was very adept at social media, but more so in my mind at understanding cable news and at understanding the media complex and understanding how much media had turned politics into reality television. He got that. And one of the reasons he got that is because his entire career he's been keenly aware of the media, whether it's the New York City tabloids or The Apprentice, and this notion that somehow, the fact that we place all of this blame on the media rather than seeing the way that he seized upon an opportunity, and then through the course of the election, like David is saying, focusing on the media, focusing on the moderator, understanding how much the story about, Megyn Kelly versus Donald Trump was going to get attention, or the biased media or the rigged media was going to get attention, how much the media itself was going to obsess about that, is just it's incredibly smart. And you can say, okay, well, the media has a responsibility to not focus on him so much and to spend equal amounts of time on every single candidate. But the truth is that the media, the political media story before Donald Trump came on the scene was, why won't politicians spend more time talking to the press? Why are they so secretive? Why won't Obama do interviews? And here, like David said, here comes this guy and he's just like, I'm here, book me, call me, book me, I'm on your show. Come to Trump Tower, you can interview me anytime you want. Here's my Twitter feed, here's what I think. There was no way a profit-driven media was not going to pay attention to that.
Let me read you something that I brought with me from an essay written by Emmett John Hughes, who was a former Eisenhower speechwriter. And this is writing around the time of the 1960 Kennedy-Nixon debates. And he writes, if television drives politics towards theatrics, so that the number of politicians who imagine themselves entertainers swells to match the number of entertainers who imagine themselves politicians, if it ruthlessly practices a kind of intellectual payola that rewards the man who can reduce the most complex issue to the silliest simplification, if it effectively invites a whole people to forswear the labor of reading for the ease of gaping, if the pungent slogan asserts such sovereignty that disarmament is discussed on the level of deodorants, if all impulses conspire to glut the channels with what sells rather than what matters, if by all these lapses and deceits the whole people lets itself become mentally trapped in a suffocating kind of isolation booth in which no sound can be heard but the voice of the huckster, the answer to the question, can television be a positive force for democracy, is a resounding no. What an interesting prescient kind of point of view from an Eisenhower speechwriter in 1960 about where our technology was going to take us. You said that you referred to Roosevelt being the master of radio, television being Kennedy's medium, and then moved on to Trump being the master of cable television. But it's really the convergence of all these media together, isn't it, for Trump? I mean, we live in an age when there is so much technology dominating our lives, and the one who can master the juggling of all those different media platforms is the one who is going to get the most attention.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the I should let someone else talk. But yeah, no, I think, sure. And I think that
I guess what I mean is not only cable television, but his ability to tweet, to be able to put an idea into this sort of very tiny crystal phrases.
Well, okay, and if 16 out of 17 candidates are going to make you go through their spokesperson and craft a very banal pro forma statement about something, and he's going to fire off something that's really controversial, I mean, that's, that people are just going to run to that, and you can criticize the media, and you can say, the media has a responsibility to do X, Y, and Z. The media, like what happened last night, is democratic. If you don't watch it, people aren't going to air it. And I guarantee you there's some great, informative, responsible programming on PBS or C-SPAN, and there's a reason that a lot of people aren't watching.
That's like asking people to eat their oatmeal, right? I mean, you end up, we're all victims of wanting something that everybody else is doing and not wanting to do the dutiful.
Well, even on those terms, though, I mean, if we're saying everybody is covering a tweet, two things are problematic with that. One of which is that, as I believe happened, Trump was able to hijack news cycles to increasingly incremental levels and in whatever direction he wanted, away from whatever he wanted, simply by tweeting out something that could actually redound against him. It could actually be controversial or offensive or take somebody out, but suddenly that's where everybody's attention focused. So that means that it's very hard to have the time to think about the implications of some other policy position, of some other candidate, heaven forbid, in a way that was meaningful. And again, we covered Trump as a controversialist and a figure of interest, I think the press corps largely, for almost all of the primary system, even though he led in the polls from middle of July of 2015 through the National Convention for the Republican Party in Cleveland with an absence of about 72 hours. So that tells you that that's not a flash in the pan. It's somebody has to be taken more seriously in scope. The second part of it is that, except for major places like CNN.com or the Huffington Post or whatever, if 1,300 or 13,000 different news organizations or outlets are posting on the same tweet, like how much incremental traffic are you going to get from that? If you're a smaller paper or you're a news organization that focuses on policy or you do something else, like why are you hewing so closely to the grain rather than cutting against it? I feel as though that's a missed market opportunity. But I also think that journalism is this odd hybrid. It is commerce. I work for a not-for-profit. It is still commerce. We need to be in the black more years than we're in the red. Otherwise, we are going to have big problems. And we all face those issues. And at the same time, it is a public service. And what values are going to dominate? CNN hired some of the best political journalists in the past 15, 18 months that are out there. A lot of them younger, terrific, giving them some of the best. Actually, this one of them. And did great with that. I think Jake Tapper, among others, performed really admirable accountability job with Trump, really pressing him, making him be confronted with the implications of what he was saying. The fact that a judge who was ruling on Trump University fraud claims had Mexican immigrant parents, somehow he couldn't be impartial because of that. Offensive to our sense as a country, regardless of party. And by the same token, CNN, was clearly acting in major swaths of how it devoted time and coverage to what we were going to watch, rather than what we needed in some ways to know. We knew about Marco Rubio's credit card troubles and the fact that he was kind of dicey on his personal finance issues in early 2015. We knew about Jeb Bush's private industrial or commercial ties to for-profit school chains and some ventures there, even as he was proposing educational policies again in the early months of 2015. I would say in the fall of 2015, we didn't have a real read on some of Trump's policies. He was kind of dictating. And again, candidates get to set the term on what's happening in front of us, but the press needs to do more than just follow that.
But with all those talented journalists, and I know there are some amazing ones at CNN and MSNBC and other outlets. The Washington Post did a fantastic job. New York Times did a really strong job. But with all that talent, we missed the story. We fundamentally missed the story. Whether it was Donald Trump playing us like a fiddle, we missed the tree for the forest. I haven't worked in a newsroom in probably a year and a half or so, but I'm of it. I've been there for 20, 30 years. The story that was happening in Michigan, Wisconsin, we missed Michigan and Wisconsin completely. Even here in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania was going to be blue, left, right, up and down, and missed that story. Why did we miss it? Probably because we were too busy covering the candidate and not spending enough time covering the voter.
Well, and covering the candidate for his combustible personality and the entertainment value without understanding that there was resonance going on with some of the policy
Right,
notions.
but it gets back to the voter.
Yeah.
For every one story that was done on, let's talk to the middle American voter, there were 1,000 done on the latest bombastic Trump spasm. And that's where the story was, and that's why we missed it. We were not in touch with those real voters out there who made a difference in this election.
Well, I would just, it's been a very, very long, I think it's been 510 days since Donald Trump came down the escalator and announced he was going to run for president. I think the media coverage has gone through waves, and I think that it has included the entire gamut. It has included investigations from guys like David Fairchild at the Washington Post. It has included coverage of every errant tweet and every controversy. There was an immense discussion out there about how non-educated voters in rural parts of this country, who turned out to be the big story last night, just did not care what the media said. And as a media reporter, like, if we had this panel on the night after the primaries, we'd be talking about, did the media boost Trump too much, like we started talking about tonight? If we had it on November 7th, we'd be saying, did the media abandon balance and objectivity and go too hard against Trump? Because there were people who came off the sidelines, because the New York Times and other newspapers called him a liar on their front page, because CNN started doing chyrons, the lower third of the screen, where said Trump said X, parentheses, he didn't. Were we, in a way, did we abandon the notions of balance and fairness? And then now we're finally having the third iteration of the conversation, which is, did we miss the story? I don't think there's a question that every single newsroom in Washington and New York had to come to terms with the fact that they don't understand the depth of anger and pain and frustration in rural parts of this country, in many parts of this country. I also think it's true that we covered every aspect of Trump, maybe not always at the right times, maybe not soon enough, maybe too late. We covered them all, and it didn't matter, because the people who voted him into office last night don't care, and they don't trust us. So it doesn't, in a way, it doesn't matter. But I would be hard-pressed to think that there is some rock that, aside from his tax returns, that we didn't turn over.
Kathleen, let me ask you something about that, what Dylan just brought up, because there was this moment, I think you're right, there was this sort of iteration of the Trump coverage in which there was debated whether there is a point in press coverage of a presidential race like this when it is justified for a major newspaper, a major news organization to step away from its objectivity and actually pronounce itself the way the New York Times did, for instance. Have you seen that as a development this year in this particular election? And if so, have we reached the moment where that's a justifiable press position?
Well, first, we haven't had this amount of editorial non-endorsement since Goldwater. So the press, Republican and Democratic press, on editorial pages were all but united in saying that this was a highly problematic candidacy. And that, I think, is an appropriate editorial role, and I think it's a very strong signal in the fact that papers that traditionally did not endorse and magazines endorsed, and also those that traditionally are on one side came to the other side. But there's a premise I want to challenge. I think we should not be making the assumption that Donald Trump won, hence someone did something wrong. There's a possibility Donald Trump won because the electorate recognized in Donald Trump something that it wanted. And we don't have a plausible explanation within the media community for why it is they should have wanted that.
But isn't the question really Donald Trump won and we are all surprised by it? I think that's
well,
the key
but that
element
speaks to a second issue.
Yeah.
I don't think the goal of journalism ought to be to get the story right, which is who's going to win. And I think it's problematic when journalism thinks that's the story. The story should be, who are these two people and how are they going to govern? Where are they similar and where are they different? And the goal should be to try to hold them as accountable as possible for whether these plans are realistic, whether in fact they're grounded in something, they have an understanding of how the history works. And when we displace that with a whole lot of poll-driven coverage, by virtue of having the poll be the frame through which any issues are seen, the tactical lens invites cynicism on the part of the electorate. And I applauded the fact that the polls were wrong this year, because it says to journalists, why did you waste all of our time based on something that had one reality check, and that reality check said it was a bogus indicator. And if we could strip back all of the journalism devoted to saying, ahead, within the margin, no, behind, within the margin, where here, where there, and say, I want to capture 82% of that, and have you journalists answer the question, how will he govern? How will she govern? What difference does it make? Can they actually do it? What difference does it make whether there's a Senate with them or against them, a House with them or against them? What's the consequence for these differences on issues such as Supreme Court? We had 34 minutes in the third debate in which Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton had the most substantive discussion I have seen since Kennedy-Nixon on consequential matters. Donald Trump throws the press a lure at the end by not answering the question about whether he would necessarily accept the outcome. And for 3 days thereafter, including all the post-debate coverage, those 34 minutes were totally lost, thereby wiping out that learning for the electorate. That is a tragedy. Now, is it important to ask whether the front parts of newspapers should retain their norm of objectivity? I think they should. I think when they don't, they risk their credibility. And I think we're going to need that credibility when we uncover scandals, and we need to perform accountability journalism. So I worry when it looks as if there's advocacy outside the back parts where the editorial views belong. And I think those newspapers and media outlets that made the decision that he was such an enemy that they had to take a different kind of posture make it very difficult for those people who look to journalism to keep distance and hold everybody equally accountable to say that they did it.
And it continues to caricature journalists as basically working for one side or the other, too, it seems. But big data, our obsession with big data is partly what drove that, too, isn't it? I mean,
yeah, I think it's totally misplaced. I mean, anybody who's done large numbers of surveys, and I have, could have said that this year is almost impossible to model. And so,
why?
Because you have low propensity voters on two sides of a race, and you can't effectively model them into a turnout model. So lower educated white voters are low propensity voters more so than higher educated voters are. Same thing with African American voters. They are lower propensity. Now you can push the propensities up and down, but you can't make the assumption that you know how the model is going to work on low propensity voters. And if it turns out that the low propensity voters on one side, say Trump's side, mobilize up, and on the other side don't mobilize up, all of the assumptions you built into those close races are wrong. And as a result, the exit polls had it wrong last night, coming to the early analysis, but the polls probably had it wrong for the 2 weeks before that too, and that drove a whole lot of the coverage. And in any event, what difference does it make who's ahead and behind? We're going to elect and there are going to be votes. So those polls, the survey polls, are going to become irrelevant anyway.
So this is, you're absolutely right, but again, this goes back to it is a reality show. And you know if you're watching a football game who's winning by the score, and you know if you're watching The Bachelor who's winning because they got the rose. And unfortunately, I just think the audience that watches this thing fold out for a year and a half or 2 years, they need scores. And it's terrible. And the version you're talking about is right. All I'm trying to say is if you tried your version, I'm not sure how many, I'm honestly not sure what the engagement level would be.
Yeah, but we do know, because the first part of the third debate is highly engaged and highly substantive on Roe v. Wade, on nature of court, on partial birth abortion / intact dilation and extraction, on Heller, private right to own, and whether or not you should have guns capped and locked inside a house or not, another part of Heller. And for that period, there is no fall off in debate viewership. What did the public tell us about whether it's intrigued? It saw that vice presidential debate, and after the first half hour, it fled in record numbers. The difference between the two, one of them was substantive about something they cared about. That vice presidential debate was just a joke. At one point, the moderator says to two people talking over each other, you have to stop talking over each other because no one can understand you. Of course, you couldn't understand her because she was talking over each other as they talked over each other.
David, what do you make of the shift to a sort of partisan point of view from the journalist?
Well, I mean, you've been seeing this play out since, in some ways, '96. With the advent of the web and the advent of cable, there were challengers to CNN, where there's market differentiation and there's the ability for voice. And I'm sure your listeners have heard this a number of times, but the inhibitions to be able to post something is really lowered. So suddenly you have people being able to express themselves. And you also started to see in recent years the notion that journalists need to develop brands. And those brands need to transcend their platforms. And platforms is sort of an inelegant term for, are you on a TV channel? Are you in a newspaper? Do you have your own blog? Do you have your own show? Anderson Cooper is, I think, a pretty strong anchor for CNN, does a lot of things well. He also loves going on what used to be Regis and Kathy Lee and sort of being the guest host there. And he loves doing the goofy stuff on New Year's Eve. And he loves jetting to Jakarta or somewhere else for CBS's 60 Minutes. And he does a lot of different, his brand in a sense transcends. CBS is his major payday. CNN, is his major payday, but he likes transcending the platform and having that brand. Well, you started to see that also, with folks like Ezra Klein at the Washington Post, who weirdly arrived through the back door. He had been kind of a liberal partisan blogger and became more interested in policy, and suddenly the Washington Post said, let's tap into that audience and that insight, and let's go with that, and suddenly he wanted something more than the Washington Post wanted to fund, and so he went off and helped create Vox as a brand, and that brand has brought a lot of interest.
What you're saying
there.
that, so even as we are turning our politicians into reality stars, our journalists are becoming reality stars in the sense
Well,
themselves.
look, I mean, one of the things about this race is that we can say we're turning our politicians into reality stars, and they kind of know they're in this bubble and cocoon that gets sort of spirited around from backdrop to be filmed against. But Donald Trump was a reality show star. Donald Trump really understood how that worked in a different way, and were he not sort of bathed in that constant 24/7 camera attention, he would wither to some degree, and he used social media to ensure that that stayed on. It was sort of a mutually reinforcing dialogue between the two. The New York Times, people are saying, took on essentially a partisan tilt by virtue of being willing to say on the front page that Trump had offered the birther lie. They didn't call him a liar, but they talked about the birther assertion being a lie. I've used a lot of elegant ways to say somebody's not correct or telling the truth, in part because I find it difficult to look into a person's soul and know their intent, unless you have an email saying, I know this isn't true, but I will say it. It is hard to be able to pin down precisely that something is a lie, but birtherism was ugly. And I think you can make the case that you can call it a lie, but it was a decision that was embraced by the Times, and then the Times embraced Trump's threat to sue them in a way that, in a sense, lionized the role of journalists. After all, just a year ago, last month and this month, we were celebrating the release of Spotlight. The movie, the Oscar-winning movie about the heroism of the paper in Boston, the Globe, under Marty Baron, now leading the Washington Post, for taking on the Catholic Church, going up the hierarchy essentially to Rome. And now we are kind of saying, well, gosh, these guys are standing up for themselves. They're basically being partisans, but they have to acknowledge that Trump, more than any candidate, I mean, even if you think of all the things Nixon had Agnew say, and all the things Reagan would sometimes say about the press, but with a smile, and Bush would say about the press, but didn't. Bush the first would say about the press, but not necessarily fully mean. It seems to me Donald Trump has created both enabling mechanism through the press, but also an antagonist. He's made the press one of the opponents against which he's running. And so the Times has, by default, become kind of, in a sense, an oppositional creature where some of its reporters have embraced that in a surprisingly strong way on Twitter and social platforms, and others feel deeply uncomfortable with it and say, this isn't how we do accountability. We do it through what we report.
I want to come back in a bit to the role of journalists looking forward in the Trump administration. But I also know that you raised something about a question that came up again in this campaign, which was when a journalist hears a lie being uttered by a politician, is it his responsibility to correct that lie on camera in that moment? Bryan, what do you think about that?
I think different journalists play different roles in that. Chris Cuomo on CNN and the morning show did a lot of that and called both his spokespeople out, and when he had candidates, called them out. Certainly the Washington Post has done a strong version of that as well under Marty Baron. But I kind of rewind back to the core issue around why we missed the story. And was it because Trump, who had enormous skills in reality TV, enormous skills in listening to an audience and going where he felt, not just thought, but felt they wanted to be taken. Were we expecting to cover a Harvard-style debate, and really he was running for student body president? He knew exactly what his audience wanted and gave it to them, and unapologetically gave it to them. And we were caught flat-footed around it. We tried to make sense of it. Dylan, you're right. We covered the media covered the heck out of every little aspect of it, but overwhelmingly out of the noise. Covered the noise a lot more than the other aspects. But it gets back to the voters. We missed what was happening with the voters. And I don't know, a day after this, whether there's an answer yet to why we miss it. Why was it? Because when we would go into a Florida or a Kansas or an Indiana or an Ohio to talk to and really learn the lives of these voters who had lost their jobs with the steel industry going away, with the auto industry collapsing, we covered them as kind of them. And we weren't of them. We came back to DC. We came back to New York. We came back to LA. We came back to the places and surrounded ourselves with the people we're comfortable with. Those stories were done. I know they were done. I read some of them. But they were kind of quieted by the overwhelming coverage of everything else.
I think it's a great point. And I think part of the reason we missed it is not so much that we didn't talk to the voters, although I think we could have done more of that. I think it was the lens through which we viewed. So let's start at the beginning of his campaign when he says that all Mexicans are criminals and rapists. And our response is, you cannot say that in politics. You are done. Because if Mitt Romney said it, or John McCain said it, or Hillary Clinton said it, you'd be gone. What we didn't think about was, how many Americans are there out there who blame Mexicans and illegal immigrants for all of their problems?
Which means that, back to Kathleen Jamieson's point, we were covering the effect on the race, primarily. We're treating it like a sporting event or something. That play that they've done in the first quarter it's going to come back to bite them.
It was always a political equation, and it was also viewed through our own, generally speaking, coastal, cosmopolitan values. So you say John McCain isn't a war hero, and our reaction is, again, politically incorrect. You can't say it, and how dare you challenge a guy who has spent so much life dedicating himself to this country? And what we miss is that there are a lot of conservatives out there for whom John McCain represents the establishment. He does not represent their brand, their version of conservatism. And you can follow it all the way through the entire campaign, where the tape of Trump and Billy Bush, where he talks about sexually assaulting women, and we're like, okay, he's dead. He's dead as a doornail. And men and women who support Trump basically shrug it off. And indeed, politically speaking, I think, in retrospect, one of the great failures of the Clinton campaign will be to have hammered home the attacks on women, minorities, disabled people, et cetera, as opposed to focusing on the one thing that has always been the issue, which is people's own economic well-being.
Of course, we haven't focused on the parallel development of the Bernie Sanders voter early on, which resonated with some of these same issues, almost confirming that was the underlying story that we were missing, that we really needed to have gotten. And to think about both of those candidates were sort of caricatured early in the process as entertainment, as candidates that were not seriously vying for the nomination in either case, and therefore were kind of sideshows, when in fact, as it's turned out, that part of the electorate that they were appealing to was substantial and important and pivotal in the end.
I remember flying up to Vermont in January to talk to Bernie Sanders and his campaign staff when he was surging in the polls, to write a piece about how did the media miss Bernie Sanders. Because all of a sudden he was just like, he was there and he was going to be a factor throughout the primaries. And I walked into a hotel lobby and I got to talk to his campaign manager and his spokesperson, because they were just sitting at the bar and no one else was around them. And there was one other journalist who had flown up with another news organization who was over in the corner talking to Bernie Sanders one-on-one. And this guy was like about to be dead even with Hillary Clinton in the polls. I mean, it's just like, oh my God, there's something happening in this country. There's populism, there's anger at Washington, there's love of the outsider. We're seeing it with Trump, we're seeing it with Sanders, we're seeing it with Ted Cruz, but Hillary's going to win.
But that goes back to
9 months
Kathleen's point that really, unless he could compete in the race, he was not of interest to your viewers. And what your argument, Kathleen, is you're not giving enough credit to the viewers, really.
Yeah, Peter Hart does focus groups for the Annenberg Public Policy Center. And if you want to do something just as an interesting exercise to ask what were voters saying, just simply go to our website and take a look at voices of the voters. And he did a focus group very early with Trump supporters. And he told me something very important in that focus group by virtue of doing it. A number of them were talking about, what does Trump say, what does he do? And Peter asked, do you think he's going to build the wall? Do you think he's going to deport 12 million people? And someone said, no, of course not. Essentially, he's telling us he's going to do more than other people, and it matters to him more. Now, if we're in the elite media bubble and we're hearing literally he's going to build a wall and he's going to, on day one, deport 12 million people, and some of his supporters are not hearing that. They are hearing, no, that's a signal that he cares more about this. He will do stronger things, but no, it's not literally saying what it's saying. Then we've missed something about the psychology of those voters' reactions. And that's important. Point two, the media did not catch the fact that Donald Trump is not a constant across time in ways that are highly problematic in every regard. Donald Trump had at least 3 different iterations of his economics plan. The first time it was essentially scored. The numbers did not come out well at all. They went back to the drawing board. The fact checkers pushed and said, wait, this doesn't work. Then the second iteration comes out. It's getting better. It's coming closer to something you might govern to. Now, it wasn't there yet in iteration 3, but it was moving in the right direction. We still had media as of last night saying that Donald Trump had pledged to immediately deport 12 million people. No, actually, he backed off that. Now, whether you expected him to say, I'm not going to do that, that's how I'm backing off, but a speech that had 2 contradictory signals. One of the signals was that no, he was now going to switch to barring those people from countries in which there was problematic activity. Well, to the extent that you're a Trump supporter and you hear that he has made a change, you think he's made a change, and the media say, oh no, he's taking this more extreme position, what do you think about the media's capacity to reflect what is actually being said by your candidate? So those kinds of movements with Trump, in those 2 cases, toward a more responsible position, were not captured in ways that I think they should have been captured if the media were really listening carefully and cared about the content of the positions and whether they forecast governance or didn't and how they related to hers.
I was working on a column earlier today. I was sent by a conservative friend, a line or in a column by a conservative columnist who I guess had written this in the Atlantic, but used to write for the Pittsburgh Tribune Review. And she said something very similar, echoed what your focus group said, that Peter Hart did. She said, the public took Trump seriously but not literally. The media took Trump literally but not seriously. And I thought, yeah, no, that sounds right.
Yeah.
That sounds pretty good. And that was written in mid-August. I feel as though the funny thing is, and I don't know if we can even trust these exit polls that will show us about how the people of America voted yesterday.
We know we can.
But let me just say this, I feel as though we did hear a fair amount about disaffected voters in national networks and in major news organizations. We really did. We heard a lot about white voters to the point where people said, well, let's talk about who's voting for Hillary Clinton, who maybe not be in a typical Clinton voter. You saw almost none of those stories. Like, that's fine, because that didn't turn out to be the story of last night. But nonetheless, one of the things I like about NPR is we actually allow people to talk in their own voices, and we treat them with respect and civility. During the Tea Party eruption of 2010, numbers of a couple of different Tea Party offshoots said that they actually thought NPR, whatever perceptions they had of whatever location we might have ideologically, they said we treated them with the most respect and sort of represented them most fairly and accurately. And so I kind of listened to that, and I think we did a good job, and I think that's partly because we have hundreds of member stations around the country in states both red and blue, and listen to the reporters there and listen to the people there, whether it's our reporters, member station reporters. That's a nice thing. One of the things we did, though, is that we fed into the idea that these were all dislocated, white, uneducated males. Yeah. And actually, a lot of other people voted for him, too. And so we didn't hear a lot about those voters, about suburban women in the ring around Philadelphia, for example, a lot of whom turned out to vote for him. Not all, but a lot did. And people who overcome their own apprehensions or never took as the woman said, took him seriously in terms of tonally the direction he was going in and the way he would shake him up, but didn't take affront or offense to a significant degree about what the implications of that were. I felt that was the stuff we meant. I think it's almost like a second iteration concern about what voters we heard about and didn't hear about.
I think there was a tendency to want to shorthand the appeal of Trump and to understand it through just immediately typecasting a lot of the voters. And with any phenomenon in life that's richer and more detailed and more interesting than that, you get more context, you understand it more completely. And obviously, somebody said last night what it was always about, wanting to punch Washington in the face. And that could be done by somebody who has a flourishing job and just feels that Washington is not being very responsive. It doesn't have to be somebody from the Rust Belt who's been displaced. Kathleen.
And a tone kept snuck in or insinuated its way in. When you listen to reporters and you read reporters, at times when they're talking about the Trump voter, they are treating that person with disdain. They are assuming that person just isn't bright enough to get what is obvious to intelligent people of the sort writing that piece or speaking that piece. And I don't think it was conscious or in any way intended, because it's so counterproductive, you'd have to assume that you're self-destructive to want to alienate your audience. But it was there. And imagine if you want the mainstream journalist to be able to have a voice that is trusted by people regardless of the candidate they are favoring at the moment. And now part of the electorate hears that, no, that voice thinks you're pretty stupid for being where you are. Well, it's a pretty good rule that if somebody thinks you're stupid, you don't think they're very smart.
Can I just make a very quick point on that, which is a great point. I think news organizations, the ones that have sort of been embarrassed by what happened last night, first they need to make a decision. One, is their mission to advance the sort of progressive cosmopolitan world in which they live, because they fundamentally believe that those are the right values and that what Donald Trump represents is not, and then they can keep doing what they're doing? Or is the mission to fundamentally represent and understand what's going on in the country, no matter what it might be, even if it's a populist, right-wing, anti-immigrant revolution? And if that's the case, and this might be near impossible, it needs to diversify its newsroom. We tend to think about diversifying newsrooms and okay, you need more Latinos, you need more women, you need more African Americans, you need more rural white people without an education. And it's really hard to do because the baseline for getting a job at a news organization is having a college education.
Well, we put it another way, you need more open thinkers.
But
you need people who are not willing to simply assume that the world should be shaped the way that they might prefer that it be shaped.
Yes.
I mean, we have one of the questions in the audience is, are any of you rock-ribbed conservatives or voted for any Republican presidential candidate during your entire adult lives? That sounds like a real friend here of the panel.
Yes.
Yes, I have too. But that's not the issue, it seems to me. It seems that what I think he's speaking to is the very, very point you're making, that there's a tendency to not so much ignore, but devalue people who don't think the way that you do.
Yeah.
Rather than bringing the true curiosity that a journalist should have to reflect the world that exists back to the viewer or the reader.
Well, in the conversation, is the media biased? The way that's often interpreted by conservatives who really don't trust the media is that the media is out there with an agenda to get Hillary Clinton elected. That's not true. It might have been a little true this election, but it's not usually true. What is true is that the majority of people in the mainstream media tend to come from liberal, progressive, polyglot, cosmopolitan centers, and that is their worldview, and that there are certainly exceptions to that rule, but by and large, they sort of, that's sort of their tendency. And so what they do as journalists is they try as hard as they can to put that aside and to be sympathetic to all points of view. But everybody's human.
Well, why don't you stand up and tell us more about what the question was meant to be?
The question is the human condition and the absolute blind perceptions that all of us have. So my question is, are any of you rock-ribbed conservatives?
No.
No.
No. So therefore, your view of conservatism by definition, let me finish please, will be skewed. Now let me ask you about your behaviors. Have any of you in your adult lives ever voted for any Republican for President of the United States?
Can I answer?
But
I'm telling you, I'm not allowed to actually answer that question by NPR policy.
I can answer. Since I became a journalist, I don't vote, but I grew up in Seattle in a very progressive household. And so in 2008, I voted for Obama, and I voted for Democratic representatives down the line. But if you were to ask, are any of us rock-ribbed liberals, my answer would be no.
Yes, I understand, but we all know by default that if it's true, the vast majority of journalists are from the left. So even in some of your analysis, as someone like me, who has been conservative since 1976, okay, even how you view some of the questions, we don't care about race. We don't care about ethnicity. We don't care about anti-immigrant. We want legal systems. We want people to come here in the right way.
Totally right.
The president arguing about what bathrooms to use by particular state.
Okay, so let me offer you.
Because you're not. What you miss is why people out there in the fields, and you had every possibility to see it because he was drawing crowds.
I think you're totally right.
And so
I think you're 100% right.
And you said you went for a president, I think you said it was. But because that seems to be validated, by definition, you are blind, just like I might miss some liberal cues once in a while because I will have this blindness. But if I was trying to report objective news, I'd make sure I could travel with people who did not think I have an incident.
So let me offer some thoughts. I think you raised some very important issues there. But when we think about bias, I think a lot of times people reflexively and understandably sort of fall into a binary sense of, are you biased toward a Democrat? Are you biased toward a Republican? Although usually the critique is, are you biased towards the liberals and Democrats? And why do we do that? Well, we do that because that's naturally how we sort ourselves in our political realms, and also it's because God knows it's how newspapers and particularly cable TV kind of say this is how debate is. It's not multifaceted. It's not multi-layered. It's really left-right split, and we're going to sort of set it up that way, right? There are biases in how people approach the job. But I can tell you, I used to cover Congress, and I've covered politics one way or another for almost 2 decades. And I can tell you that biases work in different ways. Reporters tend to be on social issues, what we now call progressive, somewhat liberal. They view, I think, largely the battle for equal rights for gays and lesbians and others through the lens of the civil rights movement, right? And so they sort of, at times, reflexively imbue a righteousness to that cause, for the idea of people deserve dignity, deserve to be treated the same. What you don't often hear is that there was a very distinguished constitutional law professor who opposed gay marriage as an equal right until 2012. His name was Barack Obama, right? And that, so, if you're going to say all people who oppose gay marriage are bigots, then I guess Barack Obama, you would have to say, was a bigot until 2012. I don't want to get an argument about him, but I'm just saying I don't think that's the way it is. On the other hand, there are a set of issues, for example, on economics, on tax policy, on certain kinds of other issues on which actually, because of the professionalization of the Washington press corps, that it has become pretty, what we now consider conservative. It's become pretty much center right or right, because I've watched it in action. They are watching their own livelihoods. All those people who get really nice jobs, as anchoring or doing certain things, syndicated columnists or the like, are watching their finances and well-being being affected by tax policy. And although the numbers may not add up for what they say they want for balanced budgets, they support certain tax policies. So you see skewing and interesting, you're right, biases and where people come from affect what they do, but there's not, it's not a binary, perfect, lined-up result in how people look at things.
I'm not talking bias, I'm talking blindness.
I think your point about blindness has validity. It really does. But as David said, it's not a digital 0 or 1. It's on a continuum. I was at CNN in 2012 during the 2012 election and 2011 leading up to that during the Tea Party movement and when the Tea Party became very strong. And I watched inside that newsroom where, no matter where people's perspectives were, their political alliances were, the desire of the newsroom to be incredibly open and fair to the Tea Party movement in such a way that CNN even was the only network that did a debate co-hosted by the Tea Party. And at that time, they got a lot of flack for it. Why are you doing this? You're not supposed to be aligning. And it wasn't alignment. It was to make sure those voices were respected and put on the same table and the same level as everybody else. So if anything, there might be a certain degree of overcompensation for that blindness. Still, we missed it.
Kathleen, you had something you wanted to interject there.
Yeah, I just want to say I'm a functional independent, which is a problem when you're in Pennsylvania because you've got to register by party, and if you're actually functional independent, you're going to be forced one way or the other, or you can't vote in the primaries. But there are habits of mind that professional organizations and professionals in organizations are taught and try to adopt to minimize the likelihood that their biases are actively at play in places that they're vulnerable. Now, that doesn't mean that they always succeed at it, but there are processes that try to ensure that that is in fact the case. And one of the things I worry about when journalists are licensed to take an advocacy role is some of those patterns of discipline are going to erode. And as a result, they won't be policing themselves because they've licensed themselves to become advocates when they're supposed to be policing the advocates on either side equally, but now they actually have a horse in the game. And so the answer to the first question that you posed is, I think, because of the constraints that journalists are able to impose on themselves, they are able to a remarkable degree to minimize the effects of bias. It is dangerous when they step outside that because their capacity to minimize those biases can be eroded in ways they're not aware of, and that's problematic for them as well as their readers.
But that's also one of the pluses about the changing media landscape, that today there are so many more voices out there, so many more news opportunities. You look at cable news as an example. What is the #1 rated cable news network? It's not CNN, it's not MSNBC, it's Fox. What is by far the dominant voice on talk radio? 92% of all talk radio is conservative. So, and then there are thousands, if not millions, of websites out there, many of which are on varying spectrums from ultra-liberal to ultra-conservative. There are so many ways of getting messages and voices and opinions and thoughts and facts out there. And if anything, this election showed that there was something there for everyone. And you didn't have to gather around the 6 o'clock news as a generation ago had to.
I will say with the profusion of sites, though, and if you think about, InfoWars and Alex Jones, you think about Rush Limbaugh, you think about Fox News, which is a complicated case and another hour of discussion. The actual number of people doing original reporting in many ways has winnowed rather than increased. The actual number of people building on the sort of raw reporting of those newsrooms has grown. And so you've seen, just as at Fox, I can tell you the budget and emphasis on opinion dwarfs what they spend on original reporting. And I think you're seeing that the news system is like that as well, where the number of people, particularly at state houses and city halls, but people doing accountability reporting, I think, has in many ways dwindled.
And that raises the question as to whether are missing the story, as Bryan so eloquently said at the beginning of this hour, was in part a byproduct of the transformation of the news industry itself, where the numbers of reporters and the amount of money that's being devoted to reporting activities has been diminished, particularly at the local level, in a way that may have been enlightening and something that we didn't get to see. One last question here, which actually does come from the audience, but is also one that I was going to deal with anyway, which is, what do you expect to see in terms of the press's relationship with the Trump administration? Kathleen, why don't you take that one? Given that he has been so dismissive of the press, talked about reforming libel laws, talked about mocked the press at rallies, and do we expect to see that there's going to be a reformation of that relationship?
I think there's going to be a lot of introspection on the part of journalists about the past election and a lot of soul searching about what could have been done better. I think the question about how the Trump presidency is going to be covered is going to be in part a function of how Trump conducts the presidency. There were multiple times during the campaign season in which Donald Trump said things that were actually consistent with all the things we've said about how you ought to campaign. And I'm hopeful about that. He had an exchange at one point about his tax plan. And the reporter was basically saying, you can't get to this point. And Donald Trump said, that's my starting point. It's a negotiation. Now, that was a smart thing to say. We always take candidates' promises in the press as if they're absolute statements and they fail if they don't get there. Well, of course they don't get there because we have checks and balances in Congress and all sorts of discussions. We're going to ultimately moderate positions. Donald Trump actually said, that's my starting point, and kind of looked at the reporter as if to say, don't you get that? That's the way the process works. Well, there is a Donald Trump who has said other things that are like that. I wonder if what we have with Donald Trump is someone who was on a steep learning curve from having no background in the political system whatsoever. And what we're seeing was him moving up that learning curve. And as a result, making adjustments at some point, and then not in others, and you'd ask why not in others. And then secondly, whether you sometimes saw Donald Trump who was an entertainer by background and was marking off parts of his life that way, basically saying, no, that wasn't me, that was me as an entertainer. Well, some of what Donald Trump was doing was essentially being in that other role of a kind of campaigner and may actually be very different as a governor. I think the press will ask itself what it's seeing in the presidency and how it should perform the accountability function. I hope it asks itself how it's performed in relationship to all of the other presidencies, because it's had problematic behaviors in relationship to them too, and asks how it can adjust so the country can best ensure that we have accountable government, but that we don't disable the capacity of those to govern to succeed in the process.
Anyone want to add anything to that about the future for the media and the Trump administration, Bryan?
I think it's a wait and see. Obviously, one of the things that makes me optimistic is that now more than ever, what journalists do matters. That the ability to go after the truth, no matter where it is more critical now in the next 4 years than it has ever been. I'm actually excited for my students that we have class tomorrow. We're going to be talking about this. That right now is when their reporting skills, their investigative skills, their ability to say, okay, you said you're going to do this or this happened. Let's see if it actually did. And beyond just fact checking, but a disciplined approach to looking at everything that is said and done and holding it up against the lens of truth. And that may get them in a little bit of trouble, but that's what journalism is about.
I think wait and see is right. And I think, like everything about Donald Trump's presidency, it's wait and see, because you have no idea. Because he's been a Democrat, and he's been an independent, he's been a Republican, and he has said things that he then said he didn't mean. Now, that's not, I think some people who used to say, God, all of the things that Donald Trump has said about the press and how he's going to treat the press and how he's going to prosecute the press and go after the press and kick press out is so troublesome that he cannot be president of the United States. And then he gets elected president of the United States, and I see a lot of people being like, well, he's a guy who doesn't really mean most of the things he says, so it could be okay. And it's like, okay, uncertainty, total having no understanding about how he's going to be, and just looking at the things he's said, to me is a very disconcerting place to be. It's an extremely disconcerting place to be, because he could do anything. He could be great. He could decide, because nothing matters to him more than his own reputation and his own ego, that he's going to be a great president, and we didn't see it coming. It is just as if not more likely that he is going to follow through on a lot of these promises in order to cater to the base that has carried him to where he got today. So I would be cautious. I would be very cautious about how Donald Trump treats the press, because it could be really bad.
David, you want to be the last word on this?
Well, let me echo a bit and pivot a bit. But, I think if the press is banking on Trump's insincerity and his ego for a transparent administration, it's a pretty thin reed to hold on to. He has, just to make explicit some of the things he said he will sue the New York Times. He has said he will sue NBC for allowing the Access Hollywood tapes to get out. He has said he intimated, didn't quite expressly promise, but he intimated in an interview with Sean Hannity in May that he would go after Amazon and Jeff Bezos over antitrust issues and concentration of power issues, because of all the reporters for the Washington Post who were asking him all of these questions. He didn't take 20 minutes and separate those two subtly. Like, they were right there at the same time. And that's a person who talks about punishing enemies. That person will now be POTUS. He'll be president of the United States. There are a lot of levers you can push. Let's be clear, Amazon Web Services have contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars with government agencies to store data securely in the cloud. And they're hoping to make that a multi-billion-dollar business. Now, maybe Amazon shouldn't have all of those contracts. The President of the United States shouldn't be deciding whether or not they do on the result of whether or not the personally held newspaper owned by the CEO and founder of Amazon, has been raising inconvenient questions. There are plenty of other examples, but these are not incidental things. The New York Times and the Washington Post did yeoman's work this campaign, and I'm fine with people deciding they want to vote for somebody, whomever they want to vote for. I think they need to know the context and facts and information. I think the Times and the Washington Post, particularly in the general election, brought that. But Trump's posture towards the press is one of, you're an adversary, and it has been a successful component of his appeal to the wave of people who turned so many states red last night. So, I'm not utterly sanguine about it. I will end on this one little anecdote. I thought back to 25 years ago. I was a rookie reporter in Durham, North Carolina, and I was allowed to sit in on this Duke trustee meeting that at one point devolved into a debate about the press and the role of the press and what they should do during difficult moments. And this one woman, who was an African-American law dean at that time at Syracuse University, turned to this famous editor, now recently died, named Gene Patterson. Used to be a top editor in Atlanta, then down in St. Petersburg. And he had basically been a hero for having the newspaper stand up and cover the fight of blacks for civil rights and integration in Atlanta and the South, despite incredible pressure from a lot of his readers and a lot of civic leaders there, or particularly in the outlying areas. And this dean said, when I was a young girl, a black girl, in Atlanta, in Georgia, I knew you guys would have our back. I knew you wouldn't ignore us. I knew despite all the pressures, you guys would be there for us. I knew that you would ensure that we weren't ignored. And he said, sure. But in 1966, despite all of our coverage, Lester Maddox, an avowed and combative segregationist, was elected governor of Georgia. We didn't have the power to prevent him. We certainly told the populace who he was, and they embraced him at that time. And she said, but you still told the truth, and we knew ultimately that what the society needed would prevail as a result of this. And it was a fascinating debate about the role of government and the role of the press and the ability to hold people accountable. But one of the things that I thought was really fascinating, the Journal also documented the surprising things that Lester Maddox did. He integrated a lot of state agencies. He instituted an early release program for prisoners there. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution held him accountable for his segregationist views and actions, and also acknowledged the things he did in government as governor that cut against that. So I think the role of the press needs to be astonishingly strong watchdog for a figure who has never held any kind of public office. And I also think it needs to actually see what the implications, the rules, the policies, the regulations, the laws, and the consequences are of what plays out in Washington over the next 4 years.
Thank you to all my panelists. Thank you to all of you for coming as well. We appreciate all your time. Thank you.